Hawkins, who's a student organizer at Cambridge, involved in divestment campaigning, free education, worker solidarity, and demilitarization groups there. He was recently involved in putting together a report on the network of partnerships between the University of Cambridge and the fossil fuel industry. And lastly, we have Sita Balani, who is a part of the Preventing Prevent campaign, which recently fired up again during the last round of the UCU strikes. And she is a lecturer and UCU organizer at King's College London. So, yes, we'll go into the discussion very shortly, but just to explain kind of the format of this session, it's going to be split up into two parts. So the first part will be this discussion facilitated with our speakers, and me and Safieh will be facilitating that and trying to link up together all these different perspectives that we have. And that session, that part will last about an hour. And then in the second part, we'll be going into 3 themed breakout rooms. So you guys can go into a bit more depth into a particular area of your interest. And the breakout rooms will last for about half an hour. And the 3 themes will be workers organizing, which will be with me and Amelia. The second one will be breaking corporate ties with Ibtehal and Ewan. And third one is ending policing with Sita and Safieh. So we'll put those in the chat as well. And as we go along the session, maybe you can start thinking about which room you might want to join at the end. And then at some point, we'll ask you to change your name badges again to the name of the room that you want to join so we can assign you a bit more easily. So just a bit of Zoom etiquette. So we're asking if it's possible to put your video on so that anyone who needs to is able to lip read. And we're also asking for people to mute their mics so there's no interference with the sounds. Obviously unmute yourselves when you need to speak. And also if you can put an L in the chat if there's a word or concept that you would like to be clarified or explained a little bit further. And one of us will pick up on that and do our best to explain it. And then we would also encourage people to put plus signs in the chat as well if there's something that you particularly strongly agree with that someone has said. And the only other thing is we ask that you don't use the chat for side conversations because it kind of gets a little bit messy, but please feel free to use it to discuss what we're talking about here. Last thing is if you have any tech issues, then also put that in the chat. And Connor, who is our wonderful tech assistant for today, who introduced himself earlier, will do his best to help you. And if you happen to drop off the call for some reason and want to get back in, then likewise message Connor on the Slack, and we'll try to get you back in here. So with all that out of the way, we will now start our discussion. So to kick things off, we really need to understand like how, to understand how global capitalism shapes our universities and how the university operates, we need to understand what we call the marketization of higher education. And you might have heard this this term before, especially in the recent UCU strikes. A lot of the conversation is about the marketization of education. So our first question I'm going to ask to Amelia is, firstly, would you possibly explain what we might mean by the marketization of education and the kind of processes that are involved in it, and then how you think universities have changed in the last couple of decades related to this, the marketization of these universities, and placing that in the kind of context of the lead up to the current pandemic crisis that we're seeing at the moment.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. There's going to be a few technical terms in this answer. So yeah, if there is lots of jargon or anything you don't understand, as has been said, like, please tell me, because I'm used to explaining this and I hear these words in my sleep. So I don't kind of think about whether they will actually make sense. But the main principle here is that normally when we talk about universities, what's said is like, aren't fees bad? Aren't fees high? That's really bad. And this is true, right? There's a huge amount of debt, and that debt has like really unfair burden, disproportionate burden on working class students. But the other thing is that when those fees were tripled a decade ago now, the rules for funding were changed. So before then, you would get a fixed amount per kind of number of students you have. Now you get the exact amount of fees. So you want to fight for every single student you can get if you're a university, because a huge amount of your funding will come from student fees. It's really different at different universities, but it goes up to about 80–90% of a university's income being from fees. So they did a lot of different things in response to this. One thing that was done was to think, okay, well, what do students want? They want, we need to attract them. And there's a bit of a problem here because students who are applying to university generally haven't been before. So the things you might build to attract those students might not be things which have that much to do with education as a whole, so much as like this kind of student experience stuff. So you might build like a flashy new gym or like a really kind of nice looking new building, but you wouldn't invest in any of the kind of core activity of the university. So lots of debt was taken on, a huge amount of debt. I think more was spent in 8 years by universities on building projects than it costs to do the London Olympics. So we're talking about huge, huge expansions. And these are financed largely by debt. I'll talk about that a bit later. Other things that were done was you have to do more for less, basically, if you want to attract more students. So this means a deterioration of working conditions, outsourcing in the first instance, cleaning staff, security guards, but increasingly academic posts as well. And that meant people being paid less, people not getting proper sick leave, and a rise of, because there's real fluctuations in student numbers, and because it's cheaper to do it this way, you hire people on a really temporary basis, hire academics on a really temporary basis to teach a module that they might not teach next year, because that's how a really flexibilized system where you don't know how many students you have because you need to get every single one you can. Just looking at my notes, what this meant was really kind of intense competition between universities, and it changes the shape of universities. So you have universities which have absolutely huge communications and student kind of attracting elements, but less investment on teaching. And you have a really uneven spreading out of where students are. So the competition between universities is really, really huge. And universities which are like less selective kind of tend to lose lots of students, because when the cap is lifted on the number of students that can go to different places, students in the UK are really encouraged to kind of trade up, go to like the best place they can, see this as like an investment in their future rather than what is the best place for you, where's a really interesting course, where do you want to go. You're kind of encouraged to like take on this huge debt and think, you know, I'm getting the most out of this for me. So one example, it's quite hard to find these numbers, but earlier this year, the University of Sunderland shut its foreign languages, politics and history department, and they'd only been able to attract 14 undergraduates the previous academic year. Whereas at UCL, between 2010, 2011, the academic year, and last academic year, they nearly doubled their number of history undergraduates. So you have some universities which are really expanding, and it's worth noting that they're not getting more people in to teach necessarily, or if they are, on very dubious contracts. So you have areas of expansion and areas of shutting down of departments which aren't kind of growth. And this need to do more to attract students with less money, with less guaranteed money, means a real market logic enters into the management of universities as well. And you have lots of academics who don't really know or kind of whenever this happens, seem to lose their like critical faculties. Someone will come in a shiny suit and say, we need to fire everyone. That's how it has to be, unfortunately. We need to attract this many students or the university is going to be shut down. And we've worked out, here's our comms plan for how to get these students, and you have to do what we say. Unfortunately, you know, we're going to fire all the junior academics and we're going to kind of like outsource this group of people, but we do need to carry on paying these managers this much because they work very hard. So this kind of management drift had a real knock-on effect on the governance of universities as well, which we can talk about a bit later perhaps, because it's quite, it's like a long, interesting, but kind of, there's lots to it, and you might be sick of hearing from me. But yeah, so it tied, marketization meant universities doing more for less to attract students because they desperately need this money. It increased stratification and differences between universities, deteriorated conditions, made outsourcing normal, and encouraged kind of partnerships with private learning companies, so like Pearson, Kaplan. These are all increasingly normal. And there's also universities looking to, UK universities expanding their campuses abroad, often with quite dodgy practices as well. So really changed how universities operate.
Thank you, Amelia. So yeah, we've, as you kind of mentioned, we've seen a greater infringement by corporations on our universities. I think you mentioned like the outsourcing to private providers, the financiers of these fancy buildings that attract students, but you know aren't exactly for our education. So the next question then is actually to both Ibtehal and Ewan. So you've both campaigned against particular ties unis have to arms and fossil fuels corporations. I was wondering if you could share more what these partnerships look like, and like how these partnerships and ties influence the operations of the universities.
Shall I go first?
Please,
yeah, so in 2019, Zero Carbon, the group I'm involved in Cambridge, published a report titled Dismantling the Fossil Fuel University, which looked at the links between the University of Cambridge and the fossil fuel industry through 4 key themes. The first was investment, so the money the university has, they call this an endowment, which is invested in corporations across the globe, and the return on these investments funds certain university activities. So in the case of Cambridge, they have an endowment of nearly 6 billion, and 377 million of that is invested in fossil fuel companies like BP and Shell. And this has been a traditional focus of climate campaigning in Cambridge and across the country through the divestment campaign. But as divestment has been achieved at now half of UK universities, people have started to look elsewhere at the broader links between universities and the fossil fuel industries. And that's what the other 3 themes kind of pick up on. So the second theme that we looked at was greenwashing. And by this term, we mean the way that fossil fuel companies use universities like Cambridge to maintain and bolster their social license to operate. So the university takes money in exchange for this greenwashing of an industry, allowing it to co-opt the university's image and portray itself as prestigious, charitable, and scientifically rigorous. The university is open about this purpose, offering, in their words, brand association benefits to companies. So a few examples of this are things like named professorships. In Cambridge, we have the BP Professorship of Chemistry. There are also awards and prizes like the ExxonMobil Prize in Chemistry, and events like the Shell Annual Lecture that is given in Cambridge, and also branded equipment, things like BP lab coats. So this, on every single level, instills the idea that the fossil fuel industry is an acceptable, charitable, and scientifically rigorous industry. The third theme we looked at was the revolving door. So the way that people move between the fossil fuel industry and universities such as Cambridge through things like training and consultancy services, recruitment and careers events, sponsored studentships and scholarships, and executives co-occupying and moving between the fossil fuel industry and university management. The fourth theme we looked at was extractive research. This is the way that work at universities is taking place on finding and characterizing fossil fuel reserves, as well as making their extraction more efficient. To just give one example from Cambridge, a Cambridge geophysicist made a discovery that saved the fossil fuel industry £5 billion, allowing them to find oil reserves more easily. After this, a BP institute was set up, and research at that institute led to further technological discoveries that according to BP, saved them between £300 and £3,000 million a year. So these and similar links will be taking place at universities across the country. And I think the lessons here for organising in the pandemic and post-pandemic university are to kind of look for themes like this across the higher education sector with the fossil fuel industry. But I also think they're kind of applicable beyond the fossil fuel industry to look at the way universities have relationships with other industries. But I think it's essential that we tie this into the processes of marketization Amelia just talked about. Universities have always had links to the fossil fuels and arms industries. To give just one example from Cambridge, the Shell Professorship of Chemical Engineering was set up following a £450,000 donation in 1945. But the marketisation of education over the past 30 years has expanded and solidified these links to create what we call the Fossil Fuel University. So in terms of the 4 themes I mentioned, in terms of investments, the formation of the university's first investment board coincided with the introduction of tuition fees in 2003. This is mirrored across the country with endowments and investments massively expanding over the past 20 years. In terms of the second theme, greenwashing, as government funding has decreased, universities have turned to the private sector, including to the fossil fuel industry, to finance professorships, student awards, and even basic equipment like lab coats. In terms of extractive research, the same, as government funding for research has declined, and the government has actively encouraged industry collaboration, extractive research has expanded. And fourth, on the revolving door, the consultancy is a revenue stream for the university. The recruitment side of things corresponds to the increased emphasis on employability in university education, and the revolving door of executives is due to the corporate management structure that has been imported into universities that makes a person who's managed a fossil fuel company suitable to sit on the board of a university, and vice versa.
Wow. Yeah, Ewan covered so much, and I think so much of that is just applicable to the arms industry as well. I think just to throw in a few examples to expand on what Ewan articulated so well. I think something to take from what was just said is, the many ways in which a university can be linked to specific industries like the fossil fuel industry, but also take the arms industry. And I know investments has been a thing that People and Planet have worked on a lot, but to just take an example of Cambridge, for example, sitting on assets worth of over £7 billion and having a college like Trinity College with investments of over 500 million in numerous horrific things like the biggest arms industries, the biggest oil companies, the Dakota Access Pipeline, Arconic, the company responsible for the cladding at Grenfell, is very indicative of how even within these specific ways in which universities are militarized, for example, investments, these industries collaborate together. And similar can be said, there's a lot to be said, and there's a lot of examples to be shared about the different ways that like Ewan just talked about. So for example, research funding, you have a couple of years ago, BAE Systems announced that it would be investing in a £10 million ammo production line that was working with Sheffield Uni, which basically is producing at maximum 10 million bullets. I think, that's again another, I guess, another example of these institutions working with industry. But I think something I'd really like to pick up on, I think we've tried to, as student groups working on anti-arms stuff, a lot of us have talked about research and marketization being a really big point because of the leaking of that into society. So maybe we can talk about this a bit later, but just to give you a flavor, this idea that corporations start to basically dictate what research is being done means that students can only they use that limited time, that limited capacity and creativity that they have to expand these horrific industries. They graduate only able to serve these industries, and it means that there's a lot that there isn't time and capacity spent on obviously making society a better place. And that I think is a really important thing of when we think about universities, about freedom of speech and all of this stuff that's often used to attack left-wing students. There isn't a freedom to think with corporate interests, and I think that's really important. One last thing, I think, just oh, sorry, if I could just make 2 points. One point is the revolving door that Ewan talked about, I think is really important. We see that on like a big societal scale. We see that with the arms industry, people who one day are directors of arms industries, another day work for the Ministry of Defence, attending meetings as different people with the same interests. And that is very much so also the case in universities. You have people like the chairman of BAE Systems being a visiting professor at Oxford. You have like Tony Blair having his own module at KCL and doing his appearances opening a specific school. Even places like SOAS, like progressive places, supposedly progressive places, with Valerie Amos, her role in like getting African states to vote for the Iraq War in 2003, that needs to be taken into consideration. These aren't people that just occupy spaces within the university. They, especially like management, have a role beyond the spaces that they occupy within the university. But also something really, really crucial is that we look at how these universities, it's important to look at the many ways within a university that these that there are ties with industry, but also how these universities work collaboratively. So you have places like KCL who provides the policy, you have places like Imperial which does the research, you have places like SOAS which gives cultural trainings to the Ministry of Defence. And until we see how all of these universities work together, then we're not going to be able to we're not going to be able to get anywhere really unless we see how they work together in these ties. Sorry, that was really long.
No, it was really long because both of you were making really, really important points that allows us to have a much more structural understanding of how these things are happening, as opposed to looking at individual cases within individual universities. Something to pick up on things that both of you said. Ibtehal, what you were talking about in terms of policing left-wing students, and Ewan, what you were talking about in terms of actually longer running ties. Actually, things have become much more intensified since 2010 and maybe in the last 2 decades overall, but you can see business-oriented restructures in universities since the 60s or something. And very interestingly, if you look, another thing that's accompanied those is increased policing of student bodies. So some research into Warwick in the 60s shows that like industrialists who were newly on the Warwick University Council were placing spies in local meetings where academics were addressing like local union meetings. And the Warwick VC received reports on the Revolutionary Socialist Students Federation from this right-wing private surveillance outfit called the Economic League via Sir Arnold Hall, like another industrialist on the council. And I think that gives a starting sense of how these things work. But you both have been involved in organizing against these corporate ties. What kind of policing response have you experienced yourselves from universities? And if you've had a bit of oversight across universities, what have you seen like patterns emerging?
Shall I go first? Is that okay? Okay. Yeah, I think it's there's a lot to say in terms of experience and stuff. I my undergrad years were at KCL, and if there's one thing that KCL can provide, it's surveillance. So I think like there's a lot of stories specifically around Palestine solidarity, organizing, and surveillance. I think that's like a take, and I think a lot of people in organizing know this. There's stuff from like just making everyday life very difficult, like planning an event and being like, you have to change rooms every 5 seconds, or like just like making admin really, really difficult to try and tire students from their organizing. It is like a basic example, but I think it's important for us to take a big step back when we're talking about this and think about the structural stuff. Like what I was just saying about research funding, I think is really important. Like you're policing the way that people think on a broader level. I think that's really dangerous. Like that's like, it's obvious to pick out, you know, the stuff about the Queen's visit and specific cases where students are discriminated against, but like looking back of like, how does it happen, for example, that it is okay for us to register international it is okay for us to monitor international students, that it is okay for students, specific students, to be put on specific lists or their names to be given to police. And I think that like not to be like wishy-washy, but taking a step back and thinking about the arms trade, for example, from my perspective, or these industries that all are one, this is like, it's important for us to understand how these industries dehumanize people. They are built on all of these oppressions, but they also perpetuate them. This stuff only happens because no one cares, or like people are dehumanized to that level. Tony Blair only gets to come to KCL and there's not even a response from students, because it's like the life of Iraqi people aren't seen as valuable. And that might be a harsh thing to say, but I think those are things that are, I think that's where I would really like us to focus when we think about policing and surveillance. And that also includes the stuff of like what Ewan was talking about with research funding and stuff. Like KCL gets lots of money from GCHQ. It gets like 5 million a year from Serco, which, you know, builds detention centers like Yarl's Woods and stuff. Like those are, if we don't start to see all of these things on a bigger level, I don't think, we're not going to get far by looking at this specific, you know, this event was cancelled. I don't know.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ewan, go on.
Yeah, and I think just kind of like picking up on that, the like violence, oppression, and like surveillance of movements definitely does take place. In Cambridge, students have faced disciplinary action, financial fines, police infiltration, Palestine solidarity events have been banned under Prevent, and the far right have targeted students repeatedly. And this can and should be discussed and addressed, and I think other speakers could probably talk about it more eloquently than I can. And I think in our organising, we must centre our preparedness for that through events like through events that People and Planet often put on, like legal awareness training and direct action training. But I think it's also important to kind of think through the kind of other mechanism of control that universities and kind of like the broader neoliberal capitalist system like applies against people, which is kind of like demoralization. And I think this is kind of what I want to focus on. It's the more kind of like insidious crushing of resistance that we see through like demoralization and hopelessness. Kind of Mark Fisher called this idea capitalist realism, the belief that capitalism is the only viable economic system, and that there is no alternative. In universities, I think this manifests itself in the belief that you can't change anything in higher education, and the idea around marketization and fossil fuels and the arms industry within education has become really fixed, or that if you do manage to change anything within universities, this doesn't target the broader kind of system of neoliberal capitalism. But I think what the history of student worker organising in campuses and beyond shows is that this isn't the case. And when we do take action collectively, we can break this, we can win, and we can challenge people's conceptions of what is possible. And that's why kind of like fostering collectivity, friendship and joy must be central to what we do, and why occupations and direct action, despite the surveillance and the crackdown that often come with them, have been like such fruitful grounds of resistance, and why we must kind of like continue to centre that tradition and that organising in what we do.
Thank you, guys. You actually really opened up into the next question, which is about broader patterns of policing in universities. And I do want to highlight that although all of these patterns are consistent and incredibly strong and pervasive, they're also stronger in certain times, and they're more targeted towards certain groups. And they're also incredibly paranoid and concrete. Like if you look back at some of the like strategic reports shared between vice chancellors, or the conferences that they had, like there's a conference in 1968, for example, between what was then called the CVCP, which is now Universities UK. Commissioning reports on student unrest, making strategic recommendations like breaking the hold of a small like niche of radical academics, on normalizing cops on campus, normalizing cops on campus, on kind of targeting the more moderate wings of student activists in order to break the hold of the more radical wing, all these kinds of things. And including a special cabinet committee set up to spy on international students, who were called overseas students at the time, who were considered a dangerous source of radicalization in one particular foreign affairs report. But it really gives the sense of how targeted, how resourced, and how paranoid the policing of political activities is. And Sita, I was wondering if you could feed in a little over there about how I mean, Ibtehal mentioned the case of the Queen at KCL. You're at KCL now. If you could talk a bit about that, but also more broadly about Prevent. How much are those kinds of patterns continued now, or what are new ways of policing that we're seeing within universities?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, I just want to say thank you for the invitation to be here. It seems like a very exciting space that you guys have created. I'm always so excited to speak to students. Invariably, your analysis is like sharper and more on point and more relevant than much of what I hear in universities more generally. So like these are the exciting intellectual spaces, and I think that if seminars and lectures were more like this, we'd all be in a better place. But I'm really glad you guys are like making these spaces and making this happen. So I'll talk a little bit about the Prevent duty, and then I'll talk about the Queen's fateful visit to King's College London. So the Prevent duty, part of the Counterterrorism and Security Act of 2015, places a legal obligation on educational institutions to, quote, have due regard for the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism, end quote. So this piece of legislation aims to preempt signs of what it calls radicalization using very vague indicators, which have led to often baseless referrals to the programme, and which, as lots of people have mentioned, raises the possibility, and in fact has, suppressed political thought. So Prevent works almost entirely without an evidence base. So even those whose research has been cited as evidence say that there is no evidence base. The idea of de-radicalization, so the idea that one would put someone who they thought had been radicalized in a kind of re-education program, is a completely speculative, untheorized, unresearched idea. Even those whose work is cited in this program say that it's an entirely experimental proposition. Nonetheless, there is now a highly lucrative research industry through university, King's in particular, of counterterrorism studies, which really just produces what the counterterrorism sector wants to hear. So the kinds of research that are done is kind of like they write the law and then someone does the research after. So it's a bit like back in the Blair years when Tony Blair said, the police tell me what powers they want and I give it to them. So the same way with this research. Sorry, motorbike outside. The Prevent program's been in place since the mid-2000s. It was introduced by New Labour, like lots of other disastrous things that we still live with. But it only became a legal duty in 2015. And since then, it's seen it become embedded in higher education at every level. It's usually framed either through diversity and inclusion or through the idea of safeguarding. And this is really important. So you don't turn up and say, and no one says, this is Prevent, you just, here we talk about Prevent, this is who the Prevent officer is. These things are carefully embedded in things that are very difficult to opt out of. It's very difficult to opt out of diversity and inclusion training. It's very difficult to opt out of safeguarding training. There's this idea that they try to push that Prevent is about safeguarding students who are vulnerable to radicalization. Now, the whole idea that someone is vulnerable to radicalization is already highly insufficient, it's already vague, and the whole program of Prevent relies on people's prejudice, it relies on people's understanding of the world through stereotypes. So no amount of unconscious bias training or diversity training can undo that, can act as a counterweight to that, because the entire Prevent program requires you to act on your suspicion. And your suspicion can only ever really be based on stereotypes. It can only really be based on a set of racial myths, racial mythologies of who is good and who is bad, of who is suspicious and who is not, of who is a danger and who is not. There's been consistent opposition to Prevent in higher education, but it's not necessarily been hugely effective. So there's been an initial wave of events, 2014, 15 and 16, under the banner of Students Not Suspects. It was really exciting to see that campaign name taken up, because that campaign name had originally come from the campaigns against border checks in universities. So we already see the beginnings of coalitional work across different campaigns. And as people have already said, that's the work that's going to be essential for us creating a different kind of university. So then things got a little bit quiet, I think, for a couple of years, and then earlier this year during the strike there was a national day of action against Prevent, and there were events on picket lines up and down the country. So there's a kind of renewed interest here, a renewed moment. I think from the moment of coronavirus and now with the global protests in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, I think we're seeing another opportunity, another window to try and push this. I'm just going to talk then very quickly about the Queen's visit to KCL, because it's something that keeps coming up, but it seems worth just like giving you guys a little rundown of why it matters. So in March 2019, the Queen was coming to open Bush House, the old BBC building that King's leased for an insane amount of money, an obscene amount of money, because King's is only part university and in some ways is more like a big capital investment company. So leasing these big shiny buildings is one of the things that they do. The building had actually been open for ages, but nonetheless the Queen came to open it. It's worth noting that none of us really knew this was happening, so they kind of cherry picked some people to attend this event. No one else in the university got up to work and got up to go to work or to college that day and thought, oh, the Queen is visiting. Like, no one had that thought. It was very under the radar. It was just a thing that happened to be going on. 10 students and a member of staff had their card access blocked with no warning. That means they turned up to go to work, to go to their lecture, to go to an exam, to go to their job on campus. They tried to swipe into the building and they were not let through. The university's head of security, Nick O'Donnell, told them, quote, "We were under instructions from the Metropolitan Police to refuse access to Bush House due to the event that was taking place. That's all I can say to you." It transpired that the students whose access were blocked came from a list of protesters, particularly one compiled after the Israel Society invited the Deputy Military Advocate General to speak at King's. Students protested this, and their photographs were taken, and data from the swipe access gates was compiled to put this list together of student activists. The students who were blocked were involved in the Justice for Cleaners campaign, the Action Palestine Society, the Feminist Society, Climate Strike, Cut the Rent. 8 of those students were Muslims. The list was handed over to the Met Police in an email, despite the lack of any kind of formal request. So there was an informal request for this data. They handed it over with no trouble. When the police said, oh, could we also have those dates of birth of those students, the head of security said, no, because then I would have to trigger an access request and then it would be obvious that I was doing this. So it's all very clear, all there via email, that they knew that they shouldn't be doing this. They knew this was not a formal request. So, but nonetheless, they did it anyway. The email suggests that this was a group of ringleaders, agitators, and protesters who moved between topics and groups according to their moods. That was their words. None of these students had had any kind of disciplinary process at KCL. None of them had had any contact with the police. And now, across all of this, it's really important to state that there was no mention of radicalisation. There was no mention of extremism. There was no mention of prevent, and there was no mention of terrorism. But none of this really makes sense without prevent. So prevent has embedded the logic of surveillance, of counterterrorism, of pre-crime into how universities function. So I think that's where I'll end it, to think not only about prevent as a kind of discrete policy, but about prevent as a key tool that's prized open the possibility of mass surveillance in university as a form of business as usual. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Sita. And I think, as you're saying, the kinds of strategies that prevent uses, you also see in the embedding of border controls within universities. So the very idea that you would use educational and welfare institutions and all of the bits within those institutions that are particularly focused on that. So you turn teaching staff into spies on Muslim students or on migrants. That you would use like counselors as also spies. Those kinds of things are also in the kind of hostile environment policies that makes universities just like hospitals, just like schools, like banks, like landlords, all involved in policing migrants within the UK. But what's also pretty striking is that both of those policies really also link into what Amelia was talking about in terms of the segregation of universities and the higher education sector. There's a direct quote from Amber Rudd, who was previously the Home Secretary, 2 Home Secretaries ago, who said that the government would be looking at whether our student immigration rules should be tailored to the quality of the course and the quality of the educational institution, with tougher rules for students on lower quality courses. That's not even code. That's directly saying that they're going to target institutions that have less resources and more working class migrant student bodies with tougher implementations of hostile environment policy. And what's interesting is that, and sad, is that the London Metropolitan University, not the police, the London Metropolitan University, which is one of those under-resourced universities, which has the highest proportion, I think, that I've seen recently of BAME students in the country. That was the university that had its license cancelled for the sponsorship of international students. Basically, the way that the kind of border control system works with universities is that universities have to have a sponsorship license in order to be able to say that this student is coming to our university, give them a visa. And the Home Office basically says that if universities don't collect data on students, don't keep files, don't report students whose immigration status has run out or who aren't complying with their visa requirements, if they don't do that, then their sponsorship license will either be downgraded or it'll be cancelled. The London Met had its sponsorship license cancelled in 2012, which left thousands of international students basically facing deportation if they didn't find another university within a few weeks, I think, which is a totally impossible call. And the London Met has also recently faced immense financial crisis and restructure, which has involved basically making a lot of casualized staff redundant. And Amelia, I was wondering if you could go a little bit more into what you were talking about in terms of that segregation of universities and how that will really affect how universities and different demographics of the student body will be affected by the pandemic crisis.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think these metrics are also really, really tied up in league tables. So one of the ways that when you have a marketized system, you encourage the competition, and one of the ways in which this competition is measured is like different outcomes, different supposed outcomes, which is why universities really focus on employability, because that gets them to higher league table positions. It also means that they develop software to kind of measure students' progression that will check how often a student uses the library, whether students attend classes, which obviously tied up in border controls as well, whether students are basically they had the capacity to see if students going to the gym, if they're going to all these different kinds of places. And they're like, oh, this is useful because it's seeing if we're helping students progress, and that's good. And that you can see how that would be really, really easily translated into the kind of surveillance, particularly of migrant students, students of colour, particularly students of colour with radical politics. So you can see how that would happen really, really easily. So the first point I want to make about the unevenness and segregation of the sector is that it's quite unusual in just how fierce the league tables are as a thing in the UK. Like in lots of other countries, obviously you do have very elite universities, but most people would go to their local university. They might live at home, or if they didn't want to be with their family, they'd go to a university in a different part of the country, but they would see those as pretty much interchangeable. Whereas league tables in the UK are like this kind of like this huge annual sport. It's like this huge deal. They're also just like kind of totally fake. So one thing that really surprised me to hear is that the Russell Group obviously presents itself as being like, we're the best universities. You can, if universities pay to join. So if you can pay enough and you meet some of their criteria, which you can, look at your own metrics and see if you can massage them a bit. If you pay £500,000, you can join the Russell Group. So it's not like some kind of, there's some kind of objective system of like measuring what universities are good and which are bad. It's all just kind of like basically a fix. And another thing is there's, with these metrics is like, when you measure something, you change it. So you draw out particular elements of it. And to measure whether something is good teaching or whether something is good value for money is not actually really possible. Another point on the Amber Rudd value for money stuff is that there's a lot of discussion of graduate premiums, whether degrees you get your money's worth. And obviously this is like a market logic, but the figures for these are also just complete nonsense again, because to work out how much an average graduate would make during their lifetime, they look at figures which are from, this is amazing, from before the 2008 crash, and when much fewer people went to university. So when people are like, oh, you get, there have been different figures quoted, like one was like over 100,000, one was 50,000 during your lifetime. Like these are not what people at university will get now. So these figures are just kind of like a complete mess, and are used to justify kind of the surveillance, the policing, and the shutting down of departments. If you have a department which is not providing value for money, yeah, all they really capture is, as you would expect, people who come from wealthier backgrounds, more likely to go to certain kinds of universities, and therefore more likely to get certain jobs. So there's a whole kind of cottage industry of these like nonsense metrics which are being used to hire people, fire people, and surveil students and staff. But they have a really big impact because they determine like where people, how many people go to university, and by proxy how much money the university will have. So there's a kind of bit of a paradox here, because in terms of the pandemic, a lot of the universities who are going to take the initial hit are some of the older, wealthier universities, because they have their program for growth post 2010 was attracting as many international students who they could charge like eye-watering fees to as possible. So I think KCL and UCL are really kind of paradigmatic examples of this. They've really tried to expand and recruit as many international students as possible to get, basically to take as much money from them as they can. So initially there'll be a shock from the potential loss of students coming to universities to that tier of universities, the ones which are older, which have more money. Some of them will be able to absorb the shock. So if you imagine kind of a Cambridge or an Oxford would be able to probably, although they might use the loss of income as a way of justifying cuts in certain places, they seriously could financially withstand that shock. The same might not be true of universities with smaller endowments, but we have this kind of tier of universities which is really reliant on international student fees, and they're going to lose a significant proportion of international student fees next year because of the way the UK's Public Health England and the government have really bungled the pandemic, and just like the UK not being a particularly exciting place to come to at the moment, and difficulties of travel. So we'll have this initial kind of shock to those kind of universities, but then the tier below, who are much more dependent on home fees as part of their income. And so to take the example of KCL again, KCL, I think about a third of its income is fees. So, and a lot of that will be from international student fees. So it's going to be a significant hit to them. But like the situation at Nottingham Trent, I think there is 80% of the university's income is fees. So even losing a few students in a few departments is going to be a huge, huge problem. So because students are really encouraged to kind of trade up the league tables and go to more elite universities, and that the government hasn't really put a significant cap on the number of people at different universities, of people being able to accept it, they've put a cap of what would have been projected for the year plus 5%. So actually it's only stopping the worst practices. But once that first kind of tier of universities who will be affected by the loss of international student fees, they will encourage students who would normally have gone to mid-ranking or lower ranking institutions to go to them instead. And obviously lots of students will. If you get like a call from, like, I don't know, like kind of places that will be doing this will be places like KCL, UCL, other kind of Russell Group universities who have massively expanded their number of students in the past few years, will try and will call people up and say, would you want to come here instead of somewhere more in the middle, or somewhere even kind of towards like newer institutions that tend to serve mainly working class communities. And those ones at the bottoms will be hit by this kind of like further down the line, this cascaded financial impact. And that can be really, really significant. Yeah, there's also, so as you can imagine, this kind of differential impact of financialization is relevant too. So if you needed to take on a lot of loans to attract students, you're in a really difficult position now, because a lot of universities took on loans on the assumption that something like this wouldn't happen, that there wouldn't be a sudden loss in students. That basically they've got loan terms that tie them to really huge growth programs. Sussex is a really key example here. So in 2017, it took out a loan for £100 million. And one of the conditions of the loan was that every single year until 2044, it has to return a cash surplus. So it has to have this much like in cash or almost cash. So this is a huge amount of money of okay. I didn't write down the actual figure. I think it was of 12 million. No, 14 million every single year. They had to have that much ready, like actual, not like cash notes, but like access to that much money every single year. So they're really screwed because you can't, if you break the terms of your loan, you might have to pay it back straight away. So they have to be, they are now in this really dire financial situation. Other universities have similar kind of things. Essex is smaller, but one of its loans means that it can't run a deficit. It's not allowed to. So if you're a normal kind of business or organization at this time, you would say, okay, next year's going to be shit. We're going to run a small deficit. But actually, lots of universities are not allowed to do that, or they will be defaulting on their loans. And they might not be allowed to take out other forms of credit. That might be one of the terms of some of their loans. So you couldn't get more loans. So they're basically, as well as kind of not being kind of tied up in all kinds of really unethical practices at home and with their investments, they are, again, the direction of the university is shaped by the terms of these financial agreements rather than what people in the university want, what kind of education should be about. Instead, it's like the path of universities is set by basically what's good for banks. And this is worse it's different in different parts of the kind of university system in the UK, but there will be an initial effect on these kind of higher ranking institutions, which will be passed down onto kind of lower ranking institutions, which were already really struggling. So we're going to see an acceleration of those really bad working practices in those institutions. Yeah, so that's what kind of pandemic projection is.
Thanks, Amelia.
Amazing. Thank you so much. This is like all so interesting. And I'm loving like how much we've been like linking up the different perspectives that we've been discussing, the about class and race in the context of the pandemic, and marketization and everything else. It's been fantastic. So we're just going to take a little short access break for about 5 minutes. So if you can come back at 4 minutes past 5, and then we'll go into talking a little bit more about organizing against these kind of struggles that we've so far discussed. So yeah, see you shortly.
Is everyone back? Put a plus in the chat if you're back. Okay, that looks good. Steff, you go ahead.
Hi, welcome back. Okay, so we're going to be wrapping up the discussion shortly and then heading into our breakout rooms. But before we do that, we have one last question, which we're actually going to go around and ask each of our speakers to answer separately. And we're going to be thinking more into the future now and organizing and fighting back against some of the struggles and the power structures that we've been talking about. And I would ask the speakers to kind of think about particularly the context of the previous strikes that we've just had by UCU and how that may have laid kind of a base for this fight and how it's possibly changed things going forward. And then also, if possible, touch on kind of anti-racist lens or a more internationalist lens. And again, specifically in the context of the recent UCU strikes, I know some prevent stuff fired back up again. And there was also demands around attendance monitoring, or well, cancelling attendance monitoring during strikes, that kind of thing. So yeah, so we'll go through one by one. If it's okay, I will ask Ewan to go first, if that's okay.
Yeah, so I guess what I'd say is I think probably the most important legacy of this was that the strikes built a relationship between student and workers on the principle of solidarity. This breaks down the divide that management tried to create between students and workers. Students refused to cross picket lines and actually joined those picket lines. They turned out en masse at demonstrations and occupied their universities in solidarity with striking staff. On a national level, pension cuts were halted in 2018, and valuations were reconsidered and employers were forced to pay more. And in the most recent round of strikes, massive concessions from national employers associations were won, and for the first time ever, national expectations on casualisation workloads and inequality exist. On a local level in Cambridge, Cambridge UCU won a major victory on casualisation with 700 fixed-term contracts established. Moved to permanent contracts, and on the third week of the strikes and the sixth day of a student occupation, Cambridge conceded under massive pressure to formally recognise Cambridge UCU, with that demand dating back 10 years. These concessions wouldn't have been won without student support, and the history of organising shows us that solidarity is rarely forgotten and will be repaid. Due to the turnover of students, we might not see this, but it will go on. And I think, particularly if we're kind of like drawing a comparison with 2010 and the last major student movement in the UK, there are differences there, but what the 2018 strikes did really effectively was break down the portrayal of student movements as lecturer or academic strikes. The 2019-20 strikes managed to reformulate this, partly due to a much broader claim on pay and conditions, but as well the incredible anti-casualisation and end of outsourcing campaigns. What this reminds us is that only 50% of workers within the university are academic workers, and therefore the cleaner, lab technician and groundskeeper are as much a university worker as a lecturer or researcher. And I think another important comparison with 2010 is the internationalism. And I think if there's a lesson from 2010, it's that we need to kind of like return to that internationalism. What's often forgotten about that 2010 student movement is that it kind of drew on two organising traditions. The first is the Palestine Solidarity movement, which, as the 2009 Gaza massacre was initiated, Operation Cast Lead was launched. Students at 30 universities went into occupation with demands of public denunciations, scholarships for Palestinian students, equipment donations, and in many cases won. The second is the climate camp movement, which was framed in terms of climate justice and brought the horizontal organising methods and emphasis on direct action to the student movement of 2010. And it was also the 2010 movement, part of a global movement against marketization in higher education that spread from California to the UK, France, Italy, Tunisia, Brazil, South Africa, and beyond. And as I think, as we like rethink, regroup, and organise in the pandemic university, we must reassert our commitment to international solidarity. And as bombs rain down again on occupied Palestinian territory, climate inaction continues, and Black people across the world are rising up against police and state violence, we must reassert that commitment to international solidarity.
Brilliant, absolutely. Who would like to go next? Does anyone like to volunteer to go next, or should I pick someone?
Pick someone.
Okay, Ibtehal, would you like to speak
Sure.
next?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I think the strikes provided a huge opportunity, and I saw like I think with the turnout and what Sita talked about, like Prevent being part of the strikes this time. I think there's a lot of promising things. I think a few students organised around like militarism as well on campus. I think that they were all like very promising things. I think there are things that need to be pushed further. So one of the big focus points of the strikes is obviously the USS pension schemes, but we haven't heard a lot about, for example, the pension schemes investments in like all sorts of horrific stuff, specifically the arms trade. And if academics and lecturers and workers, that becomes a responsibility that can't be ignored. And to be honest, it's not just even that. Like I remember at SOAS, one of the suggested places to study was at Senate House when there is an ongoing strike. And so if there isn't that collective organizing, I think, yeah, we're going to have a problem. And part of that collective organizing, I think, comes from what we spoke about before, of like understanding how these industries are one and the same. They're not just industries that work together. They literally are the people that are on the board of directors, are on board of directors for numerous horrific companies. I think I just want to bring up the example. I talked a bit about like Cambridge's investments in like Arconic, the company responsible for the cladding at Grenfell. That company also supplies parts for F-35s that are used by Israel. So I think literally that those kind of companies that kill people in so many ways, if we don't have this understanding, then and we compartmentalize all of our organizing, I think we're going to run into a lot of problems. And I think it's a bit unfortunate. I saw something happen with an Oxford discussion about fossil-free winds, and the arms industry was like completely isolated from that discussion. People actively said, we don't want this to be part of the demands. I think that's such a shame for even specific fossil-free campaigning. So yeah, I think that there's a problem. There are some things that we need to work on. A really powerful thing that I think we can do to go forward is like imagining a new university. And I don't mean that in a wishy-washy way, but because these institutions are built, they can never be decolonized or demilitarized in a sense. I think it's important for us to think of an alternative, and we've seen that with schemes like the New Lucas plan with workers, building up a plan of what their skills could be used instead of in specific arms companies, what they could be used to build like dialysis machines and stuff. Students can come together to be like, this is what could happen if corporations weren't funding our departments. Academics would be like, this is how we could treat. This is how academics and workers would be like, this is how we could be treated, this is how we could work. Like, I think it's not like a far-fetched idea, it's genuine stuff that people have worked on. And yeah, I think a big part of this is like, this isn't to like take away from any demilitarization or decolonizing movement, but I think the big way that we can move forward is shattering that image of the university. So it's just delegitimizing the university. That's the closest we can come to decolonizing and demilitarizing these spaces that are going to always continuously find new ways to be militarized, find new ways to colonize, right? So delegitimizing that thing of like exposing the hypocrisy, I think is the most powerful way to make these institutions crumble, and provide the space for us to use these resources to build something new.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I totally agree, especially in this thinking about an alternative that we can present, and providing a vision of what we can be like to go alongside our demands is something I think UCU are thinking about now as they go into the next stage of their disputes in the context of the pandemic. So we'll move on to the next speaker for the same question. So Amelia, would you be happy to go next?
Sure. Yeah, I think that the point about joining up the different struggles between universities is really, really crucial. I think one thing is, if we think about our development as a movement, as a student movement, there is also this unevenness in that development. So we have a lot of the activism is clustered in the universities where students have more free time, where students tend to be wealthier. So I think we need to think about how we share that expertise around, how we share that capacity around, and how people kind of make sure that they give that platform to other universities where actually the conditions are often worse. Just briefly, I think on the UCU situation, we've come quite a long way quite quickly. So when I was an undergraduate, there were some strikes once which were like an hour long. They were called like the cigarette break strikes. They were not real strikes. So we've built up like a degree of militancy, but I don't think we should overestimate the position we're in. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, and a lot of building, especially at branch level. So supporting in the building of that infrastructure, thinking about reps, thinking about committee roles. There tends to be like an old guard in lots of these places who are happy to basically go along with what management says. So it's kind of supporting whether you yourself are a union member, or you're supporting, if you're an undergrad, supporting people who are really pushing those kind of militant voices, and not just saying, oh, well, the branch has said this, because actually there are struggles within the branch, and it's making sure that the voices of the most precarious and those with radical politics are really brought to the fore within that organising.
Yep, totally agree. Thank you for that, Amelia. And now we will finish off this question and the whole discussion with Sita.
Great, thank you. I think hopefully my answer will build on what people have already said. Yeah, I think that the latest round of strikes were obviously, it was really great that that happened, but I think that their efficacy was kind of muddled by the coronavirus crisis, in which one of the things that we saw that was important is that academics, especially permanent staff academics, particularly from more elite universities, are a fairly conservative bunch in the sense that they tend to lack imagination. So I would highly, highly advise against building any kind of campaign that places that group of people at the centre. They are absolutely the last people you should consider to be the target or the subject of your political organising. And I say that as one of them. So from the inside, I can tell you that is not the way, that is not the boogie. It's not going to start from there. It's going to start from anywhere but there. And so the reason I say this is because I think, Ibtehal, you're exactly right, we need to delegitimise the university, and you cannot do that through the people that have the greatest investment in the university as it currently stands. And so those are the people that you don't try and win over, those are the people that you should ignore for a while. In the end, when their backs are against the wall, we'll see what side they choose, right? But that's the only way to understand the permanent academic and their role in the struggle. Unless they prove to you that they are fighting shoulder to shoulder with you, assume that they are at best neutral, at worst an active force for conservatism within the university. Even those that teach Marxist history, even those that talk a good game, like, what do they do? Because that's what matters. And so I think we need to just consider that the struggle for pensions, though it's important, we also need to put it in context, because it's everything else has to come first, in terms of precarious staff, in terms of non-academic staff, particularly cleaning and security staff, in terms of students, particularly those who are working 3 jobs to do this, particularly those who are first generation university students who are taking on a lot of debt in order to do this thing. So I would say first thing, like, kind of sideline the permanent academic in all of this. They'll come to the table at a different moment. The other thing I would say is that there are 2 countervailing trends in universities. The first is towards securitization, extraction, like highly capitalistic commodification, general violence, general destructiveness in the world. And the other is this recent trend towards this idea of decolonizing the university. And I think what's really important is to make sure that that call continues to have material demands that are not about changes to the curriculum or having more people trained in diversity or unconscious bias or whatever. So ensuring that the university's sudden statements of support for something like Black Lives Matter are used strategically as leverage for significant material demand. So don't get bought off is what I would say. Don't get bought off and don't get distracted. It seems like from what people have said on this call that there's no worry about that. It sounds like everyone's totally on it, but I thought I would kind of sound the alarm just in case. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. And yeah, what a way to finish. All those answers were amazing. I've personally learned so much in the hour and a half or so myself. We are now going to move into the breakout rooms that we just we've been discussing, and we've put some information in the chat about that, so hopefully you've all seen it. I give you one more chance to change your name tags to specify what room you would like to be in. And one other thing is also, if you're on Twitter and would like to tweet about this at all, if you could use the hashtag PowerShift2020, that would be fabulous. And I think we're going to be...
Steff, I'm just going to add that we decided to combine the corporate ties and the UCU bits, particularly in the way the direction has gone. It seems like it would be really useful to discuss them in conjunction, how workers organizing and solidarity can help to break corporate ties. So it's actually 2 groups now, but our tech support will be arranging it like that. And we may have to extend it by like 5 or 6 minutes just to leave some time for questions, or 7, if that's okay with everyone. Cool.
Just before I open the rooms, when you enter in the rooms, there will be a little icon at the bottom that says ask for help. So if should there have any like technical issues within the breakout rooms, you can just hit that and I will see it. Enjoy.
No, it's still mostly us. No, everyone else is coming back. Cool. I just wondered if so we're all back. I would love to hear like a long summary of what all the discussions were, but I wondered if maybe one person from the other group and one person from ours could just share something that struck them from the group discussion. Yeah, so just passing over to the corporate ties and UCU group, if one person wants to share something. You just put a 1 in the chat. It doesn't have to be a mad genius point. Okay, fair. I recognize that it's quite a big group, so it's hard to suddenly summarize and share. I wondered if one of the speakers from the other group wanted to share something. Yeah, or maybe one of the people who asked the question. Daisy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just asked a question in the group about how to ensure you're centering non-academic workers' voices and like building those relationships with them. And lots of people said lots of helpful things, but I think the main point was just like forming those ongoing relationships as you go along, like even in non-political contexts, so that you have bonds with people so that you can easily ask them and help them out with queries about like their job or their pay or etc., and like forming that solidarity as an ongoing thing rather than just when you need it for your campaign. Yeah.
Thanks, Daisy. Really important. And anyone from the group on ending policing who asked the question, you want to share like what you thought of responses and stuff? Maybe it's a bit unfair for me. Did you want to share reflections from the group?
Sorry, was that to me?
No, I was
Okay,
saying
correctly.
Sita, if she wanted to share reflections. Sorry, yeah.
We had a good chat, and there was a question at the end about imagining another kind of university and the difficulty of doing that. And I think one of the ways to do it is to begin from the idea of like what's valorized about university and imagine it wasn't valorized, right? So we valorize getting good grades, like we valorize that idea that your value, your worth is determined by your degree classification or by the mark you get in an essay or whatever. And I think we might want to start there. So maybe the beginning of trying to end policing in the university starts by taking a less punitive approach to learning to begin with. So I think, like, for me, trying to imagine a different kind of university is partly about one where there's no swipe gates to get in and out, partly about one with no ties to policing or the fossil fuel industry or the arms trade. But it's also about imagining a space in which learning is not tied to a qualification. So I think, obviously, that seems like a kind of big goal, but I think it's one that's worth, like, starting from and then seeing what comes out of your imagination if you begin there.
Yeah, thanks, Sita. And I think that that's a wonderful note to end on. And just to add to that for a second, one of the reasons I've been talking about some of the history of student movements and university responses to it is to just remind ourselves of where we're at different points. I think one thing to remember is that at one point, students organizing in universities in the UK thought that they were part of real global revolution, not talking about it in like a metaphorical way, literally tied to like the revolutionary movement in South Africa, communist guerrilla fighters in Vietnam, Mozambique, and Angola. They were learning politics on local workers, including migrant workers, picket lines, and universities and the general establishment feared them on that kind of scale. And I think that after there was a huge Sorry, I don't know if I'm breaking up. I hope people can hear me. But yeah, it was a huge setback we faced, from Thatcher to 2010. The 2010 movement grew up and it broke down again, and now we've been seeing things growing. So yeah, from maybe the last 5 years to a completely different scale, but we're still facing these questions of how to expand the horizons of that. And I think that this whole discussion has brought that out to an incredible degree. And I hope that people have found that and find it useful, and we can take it forward into the more specific concrete skill sessions that we're going to have over the rest of the 2 weeks. We'll probably have to wrap up now. I don't know if Steff or any of the speakers want to share any last parting thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was just like a really rejuvenating, invigorating kind of session to hear amazing voices. And I'm really glad that we put on this like kind of session, a more knowledge sharing kind of session. And yeah, I'm hyped to go away and put it into practice with UCU organizing mostly.
You and Ibtehal or Amelia, did you want to say anything, or do you want to wrap up?
Oh no, just thank you so much for putting this on. It's been so great. I think just something like 2 quick things just to highlight and to just reiterate is that like the collective nature of this organizing and like how important that is. And the second thing is basically what you and Sita just so eloquently talked about, Saf, about reimagining the university and not being afraid to do that.
Yeah, I think I'd just add that it can often feel, I think, within these movements that we fail if we did not achieve our kind of goals of abolishing the oppressive institutions that exist within campuses and within the cities we operate in. But being part of these movements does have like really powerful effects at a micro level. It radicalizes many people, including myself, and builds really like strong bonds between the people who are involved in those movements that they then carry on into the rest of their lives and the rest of their organizing. And I think for the position of radical academics and students, when they find themselves in a space of the academy, they can use that to create, they can use their position to create room and possibilities for organisers to use it for their ends and to orientate their work towards the needs and desires of organising. So I think, yeah, you use that space when you've got it.
And Amelia, do you want to share anything?
I think the points made about reimagining education are absolutely vital. Trying to look at it in this non-instrumental, genuinely open, really transformative way, and thinking about how we can create alternatives within the university, but also outside of it if we need to, and thinking about how closed off universities have become from society, how much they've been used to just launder the reputations of all kinds of organizations and use for private profiteering, and how much they've changed quite quickly, but also how that suggests that it can be really different, and that it is possible to imagine something that was not universities we have, and that might also be outside of it. So being prepared to look outside of the university for that education activism as well.
Thank you all. This has been really incredible for me as well. Steff and I were both extremely hyped, and this has lived up to the hype. And we really, really look forward to carrying on these discussions in all of the chats and sessions that come after this. Thank you all so much, and also for being patient when it ran a bit over time. And yeah, we'll see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.